dusty little town of California. This was enough to unleash the chaos that followed shortly after. Immediately, Samuel Brannan set up a supply depot for the gold hunters who would arrive.
Gold! Gold! Too many, my people! Gold! Gold! Too many! Gold! Gold! Too many!
Chapter 1. Discovery and Dissemination of the News. The year was 1848, in what was then California. It all began when gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill Ranch on January 24, 1848. This location belonged to the Swiss-born pioneer John Sutter in Coloma, near the American River. Foreman James Marshall and a group of men were building a flour mill when they found some nuggets of pure gold. Although the pioneer John Sutter wanted to keep the news a secret, fearing that his project for a large agricultural plantation would be lost. His worst fears were realized when on March 15, 1848, that is, barely 2 months later, the newspaper The Californian broke the news. The journalist who wrote it was Samuel Brannan. Later, on August 19, 1848, that is, less than 6 months after the Sutter's Mill event, the New York Herald became the first newspaper on the Atlantic coast to reveal the lucrative news to the world. This effectively put the lid on the bottle, unleashing the frenzy that, in the history of the United States, came to be known as the Gold Rush. Later, the confirmation of the President of the United States, James Polk, took place on December 5th of the same year, that is, 1848, in a session of the nation's Congress. Chapter 2. What came next? It was a maelstrom. The news of the discovery of gold in California. The news spread like wildfire and unleashed an unprecedented migration never before seen. More than 300,000 people migrated from all parts of the world. From every corner of the United States, Latin America, Europe, and even Asia. This had an enormous environmental impact. California, before what history has called the Gold Rush broke out, before the news of the discovery of gold was disseminated, San Francisco was a tiny city, barely 1,000 souls, and very soon, the golden land of California, it was invaded by all kinds of people. Good, honorable, enterprising people, and also true human scoundrels displaced from all corners of the world, driven by the thirst for riches and, why not, for genuine advancement on the socioeconomic ladder. And it was this generation that came to be called the 49ers, the generation of 49, for having arrived in California in the year 1849. Evolution of Native American territories. When the local residents learned of the discovery of gold, they rushed to dedicate themselves to the search for the precious metal, and San Francisco became a veritable ghost town. Although later, during the population explosion that began in 1849, remembering that this was the year of the spread of the California Gold Rush, its population grew exorbitantly and chaotically, skyrocketing to around 25,000 inhabitants. Like other similar settlements, the infrastructure of San Francisco and other surrounding towns was soon overwhelmed by the sudden influx of people. The newcomers had to find lodging in abandoned tents, makeshift cabins, or sheds salvaged from abandoned ships. Chapter 3. The Routes to Gold, a journey of life or death. During the Great California Gold Rush, reaching the land of gold was no easy feat. The so-called 49ers, or Argonauts, faced perilous and grueling routes where fortune and death walked hand in hand. Imagine for a moment that you're in that era. You've just heard a rumor that there's gold in California. Lots and lots of gold. And you want your share. But there's a small problem. How on earth do you get there? Well, back then you basically had 4 options, and none of them were exactly a walk in the park. The first was to board a ship from the East Coast and arm yourself with patience, because that journey could take between 5 and 8 months. Why so long? Because the ship had to circumnavigate the entire southern tip of America. We're talking about more than 33,000 kilometers of sailing. Imagine months at sea, with all that entails. The second option was a bit more ingenious. Some decided to cross the Isthmus of Panama, yes, through the jungle, on mules and in canoes. That took them barely a week. Then they reached the Pacific Ocean, and from there took another ship to San Francisco.
Gold! Gold! Too many, my people! Gold! Gold! Too many! Gold! Gold! Too many! Faster, yes, but the Panamanian jungle wasn't exactly a friendly place. Now, there was a third route that very few people knew about. Some travelers left New York for Veracruz or Tampico in Mexico, crossed the country overland to cities like Guadalajara or Tampico, rode on horseback to Mazatlan, and from there took a ship that in 4 or 5 weeks dropped them off in San Francisco. It was cheaper and took less time than the long sea route. But in the end, do you know which route most people ended up choosing? The land route involved crossing the United States itself from east to west, that is, from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific Ocean, along the famous California Trail. Many preferred to avoid the southern territories, such as Arizona and New Mexico, because crossing there was practically suicidal. And be warned, it didn't matter which route you chose, because they all had their own dangers. You could die in a shipwreck, contract cholera or typhoid fever, or simply be stranded in the middle of nowhere. So, my friend, yes, the madness unleashed by greed and the search for a better life, the gold rush wasn't just a matter of luck when digging. Simply reaching California was quite an achievement. Chapter 4. Consequences of that whole maelstrom. How did that whole maelstrom end? The consequences of that whole maelstrom were... And so it was that, little by little, what began with a simple sieve in the cold water of a river became one of the most brutal and fascinating transformations that American soil has ever known. At first, it was enough to just put your hands in. The sand of California was so rich in gold that the first miners collected it almost effortlessly, sifting through the riverbeds with rudimentary tools. But greed has an implacable logic. It always wants more. And when the easy gold ran out, the machines arrived. The miners began to divert entire rivers, to build artificial canals, to expose riverbeds that had been underwater for centuries. And then came hydraulic mining, high-pressure jets of water that gutted entire hills in search of golden nuggets. A technique that, by the mid-1880s, had extracted 11 million ounces of gold from the bowels of California. The numbers are dazzling. But behind every ton extracted, there was a price that doesn't appear in history books. Because the gold didn't come alone. It came accompanied by gravel, heavy metals, and chemical poisons like arsenic and mercury, which spilled into the rivers, poisoned the land, and left landscapes that, even today, have not been able to recover. There are areas in California where vegetation simply doesn't grow, visible scars on the land, like wounds that won't heal. But the deepest wound wasn't the one in the soil. It was the wound inflicted on its people. History books tend to gloss over this, something that doesn't fit well with the epic narrative of progress and wealth. Before the first miner arrived, before James Marshall found that first glimmer of gold at Sutter's Mill, California wasn't empty. California was inhabited, and it was inhabited by the indigenous peoples of the Americas. For centuries, they had built their lives there, with their languages, their knowledge, their ceremonies, their unique way of being in the world. In 1845, it is estimated that around 150,000 native people lived in that territory. By 1870, in just 25 years,
Fewer than 30,000 Native Americans remained in the territory we know today as California.
It was not an accident. It was not an inevitable tragedy. It was the direct result of diseases brought by newcomers, famines caused by the destruction of their lands, and something that historian Benjamin Madley dared to call by its name: more than 370 documented massacres, in which men, women, children, and the elderly were murdered. More than 16,000 lives taken. And in 2019, California Governor Gavin Newsom acknowledged it before representatives of those indigenous communities with a word that carried the weight of gold itself: genocide.
There is no other way to describe it,
He said, adding,
and that's how it must appear in the history books.
that, essentially, is the gold rush. We cannot tell this story by focusing only on the glittering nuggets and ignoring the human tragedy and environmental disaster it brought with it. Chapter 5: Those who became immensely rich, and those who remained poverty forever. Now, who got all that gold? The reality is more complex than the myth suggests. Not everyone who went to California became rich. Most miners earned modest profits, if any at all. Those who arrived late often lost money. There were merchants who amassed fortunes, like Samuel Brannan, who bought up all of San Francisco's mining supplies before the news spread and resold them at astronomical prices. But there were also those who lost everything in the fires that ravaged towns with almost comical frequency. The truth is, over time, the business became more concentrated. By 1855, gold mining was no longer the domain of a lone man with a pan. Large companies, heavy machinery, and capital were needed. The independent miner gradually gave way to the mining entrepreneur. And California, meanwhile, was growing at a rate that astonished the world. Before the gold rush, California had about 15,000 non-native inhabitants. In just a few years, it became a territory with cities, churches, schools, newspapers, its own constitution, and a seat in the United States Congress. On September 9, 1850, California became the 31st state of the Union. In a decade, it had gone from a remote frontier to the heart of a national dream. And that dream was exported. California Gold financed the first transcontinental railroad in the United States, opened in 1869, which connected the country from coast to coast in days, when previously it took months. It stimulated economies in Chile, Australia, Hawaii, China, and Great Britain. And it triggered, almost literally, the Australian gold rush, which we will also cover here on our History channel, diving deeply in history. An Australian gold-seeking adventurer named Edward Hargraves, who had been to California, returned to his country, convinced that if there was gold in California, there must be gold there too. Hargraves was right. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of all this is neither economic nor political. It is cultural. The gold rush instilled in the American and global imagination the idea that wealth could fall into anyone's lap, that luck and audacity were worth as much as a lifetime of work. The historian H.W. Brands called it the new American dream, no longer the Puritan dream of slow and patient accumulation, but the dream of instant, dazzling fortune, achieved in a stroke of audacity.